Okay, we're back. Read 516, week 2. This is part 3. So I was saying before that the same similar thing can happen with teacher feedback, right? So you're having a student read a passage to you, you're trying to get a measure um, of how well they can read that piece. They don't know a particular word. They look up at you. You do a teacher assist. You tell them the word. They go along. You've just there influenced your data, right? So you've altered the quality of the data you're going to get by doing that teacher assist. So that would be an issue with reliability. You're giving a student a comprehension assessment, which features 2 literal comprehension questions. So would this practice in itself be a threat to validity or reliability? And so the answer there um, would be validity. And you could actually argue that it goes against all types of validity too, right? So there's first not enough questions on that assessment, and the idea that literal comprehension does not represent all of the types of comprehension that students need um, to all the comprehension skills they need to possess. And so um, talking about content, you're talking about construct, validity, and then consequential, right? What do you do with that data? All right, so score reports. With formal assessments, you often get a score report with student results on it. So, last week we mentioned, or I said, they could be in the form of percentile scores, right? So percentiles are expressed in terms of a percentage of persons scoring below that given raw score. So if you score in the 90th percentile, that means that 90% of the people score below you. Standard scores such as deviation IQ or Stanines is another way that you can get data um, reported from a formal assessment. Sometimes you get grade or age equivalent scores, so you read on the level of a typical second grader, or you are performed like a typical fourth grader, however that is. But those are based on average scores for students in each of a series of other grades um, or years, and can be expressed in years and or months. So uh, 7 years, 4 months. Second grade, 6 months into the year. You may want to consider requesting to view the formal assessment results for the student you're going to use. It might give you some interesting insight into the student's reading abilities and how they score on those tests. As a starting point, it's also interesting sometimes to compare what you're getting from the student on your series of diagnostic assessments to their performance on formal assessments. So you can take a look in your text. Page 463 and 499 have more examples of formal assessments. So let's talk a little bit about the core measures that we had you, or we're going to have you look at all semester pretty much, right? So the core measures um, are not at all large scale achievement tests, right? So they're used for diagnosis, and they're given individually. So you don't have to give every student in a class those assessments at the same time. That's not how they're intended to be given. They're intended to be a one-on-one experience between the teacher and the student. There's different assessments for different purposes, right? So there's a phonics assessment to get phonics data. There's as much as we don't love it, there's the San Diego Quick intended to give you an idea of reading level. So there's different assessments that you would use when you're looking for different types of data. And then there's a difference in the primary grade assessments that you would give, and then the assessments for older students. What's neat about these is that they are a good mix of assessments, and we'll talk a little bit later about how they have some structured assessments in there as well. So more on the types of assessments. So you have assessments in there that you can use for screening, right? So the screening or the baseline data. So you want to get some information that helps you determine a starting point to see if the student has a clear mastery of certain targets. So an example of a screening assessment might be something like DIBELS, right? I think they talk about it in your Lipson and Wixon on page 121. They may even mention DIBELS, but they definitely talk about screening, and whether or not you like that assessment or give that assessment or have no thoughts about that assessment at all. It is a commonly used assessment for screening, so just to get that baseline data. Then we have assessments that we want to use for progress monitoring, right? And that's ongoing assessments that we use to determine if students are making progress. So examples of those would be like running records. We have diagnostic assessments, and our diagnostic assessments look at specific skills and they assess those specific skills to determine what students' strengths and weaknesses are. And you can find more on those on page 443 in your text. And then we have outcome assessments, and those are our more summative assessments, and they kind of occur at the end of a unit or at the end of the year. So these are the ones that they kind of go over in core in that section that we asked you to read in the beginning. So this was their take on assessment and the types of assessments. So according to core, why do you assess? The reason they give you the variety of assessments that they do is because they believe that reading is a complex process. There are two major processes in fluent reading, the first being decoding and the second being comprehension. And they feel there's this need to isolate these two components to see where the breakdown is. So if you know where that breakdown is, you have a better likelihood of providing more targeted instruction to accelerate student achievement and student learning, which I cut off the last word. Sorry about that. So you can look at those assessment sequence charts that are on pages 12 to 15. If you take a look, what they do, which is really nice, a lot of teachers find these quite helpful. They break it down for the younger grades, like K3, kinder, first, second, third, which assessments you can give, in the beginning of the year, in the middle of the year, late into the year. You're going to use this as a guide as well. And it's neat because it tells you, you give this piece. When do you generally stop giving this piece? Gives you an idea of the frequency with which you should give these assessments. So these are very useful charts. And then they go ahead, and what's neat too is as the students get a little bit older and you have other assessments that you would give, the ones on the previous page are more your earlier, more emergent reading assessments, but here, as you become a more sophisticated reader, it's nice that they tell you, start here, if low, go here, and you keep kind of going down until you dig. If you give them that comprehension assessment and they're on grade level, you don't need to really go ahead and give them anything else. They tell you if they're weak on assessment, try looking at their fluency. If they're still low, then kind of move down the list, right? So really nice, really useful charts, not just to know which assessments to give, but to give you an idea of how the skills are integrated and what you should be looking at. All right, so let's move on. So from formal assessments, let's move on to a discussion of formative and diagnostic assessment. So this was chapter 9 of your text. And so our formative and diagnostic assessment are really the opposite of those norm reference standardized tests. They're more tied to your curricular content, and the actual instruction that's happening in the classroom. They can be more fine-grained than those external published assessments, which for a teacher can help you more accurately and meaningfully plan your lessons. Um, they should or they tend to focus or be focused on both the product and the process, right? Then they give teachers immediate feedback and they enable teachers to interact with the students and then we hope adapt the assessment to the individual student or individual learner. So we're talking about classroom-based assessments, right? Remember back to that standard 2 and talks about the importance of the teacher as the agent. The teacher gives most of these assessments, right? So remember formative, that idea that you're trying to capture data or capture a picture of the student learning as it's occurring, right? So are students learning? That's our formative piece. So examples would be, oh, look at this, my picture is going to run into this. Running records during oral reading, just when students are reading, you can go ahead and you can time them. A 1-minute time fluency assessment, word sorts, teacher-made tests, having students give you an oral retell, excuse me, or a written retell, asking questions, evaluating students' written products, those observation protocols or checklists that you can find. So these are the things that you can be and should be using every day as you work with students. So as Pinnell would tell us, teachers need assessment tools that help them become noticing teachers, right? So what is a noticing teacher and how do you become one? Noticing teachers plan the assessment type and the kind strategically, right? So they know which of those types of assessments they want to use and they know why they use them and they plan on when they're going to use them. They listen, right? So they are aware of what's going on in their classroom. They learn to recognize patterns in whole student learning, individual student learning, but they're really aware of what's going on with the students in their room. They can connect those pieces of information, right? So when they're thinking about the types of assessments that we just mentioned on that slide before, they are looking at them to create a picture of the student learning that's going on in their whole classroom and with individual students. And then a noticing teacher takes that information, reflects on it, and plans accordingly. So of course, like everything else, there are limitations and pitfalls and things that we should be aware of. So first off, it's time consuming, right? Doing all of those things and actually recording them in a meaningful way or putting them somewhere or taking the time to reflect takes a lot of time. There can be teacher bias in the interpretation of the data that they're getting, or sometimes it's just limited or lack of expertise. You should, beware of informal assessments that assess skills in isolation. So it's not that you can't use those, like a 1-minute time fluency to try to drill down. But again, you don't want to make some major instructional decision based on those 1-minute time fluency. What did they give you that gives you a complete picture of what's going on with that student in relation to reading? So beware of tests that assume reading is a hierarchical process, that, if the student can't answer the comprehension questions, then it absolutely must be a fluency problem, and then they're having a problem with fluency, it absolutely must be a problem with phonics. Some of those skills are fluid. It doesn't mean then when you tackle your instruction that you must do A before you do B, before you do C. You need to have a relationship between how the reading and writing is assessed and how it's produced, and so that can kind of be something that's limiting with some of those informal assessments. And when you want to use the data, make sure that you have multiple sources. So I will give you the bottom line on our last screencast.